everybody. I'll wait for you to get seated. Can you see me? I mean, if you want to hide and sleep, then stay there. I won't know. Well, at my talk over at the Fieldhouse Museum, we concentrated on the history of the Christmas tree in America. And today we're going to go back further, talking and broaden it out to talking about more customs than just that. And as I like to say, the key to the character of any traditional festival is in the season that it takes place in. And for agricultural societies, winter was a retreat, forcing people off the fields and into their homes. Winter daylight, then as now, contracts until it reaches its nadir on the winter solstice. That's the shortest day of the year. And every day thereafter is incrementally longer and brighter, sort of tantalizing people with the hope of warmer and brighter days ahead and a return to agricultural tasks. So midwinter festivals of whatever religious stripe tend to emphasize light through a bonfire or candles or a lamp, and also to glory in whatever greenery persists through these difficult days. And such was the case with the Roman festival of Saturnalia, which marked the start of the winter sowing season. Dedicated to Saturn, who is the god of agriculture, and let's have a little look at him here. He's an older gentleman with a sickle, and he's part of the inspiration for the figure of Death in the Middle Ages, who later becomes the Grim Reaper. The Saturnalia started on December the 17th, and it was the most popular festival in the Roman calendar. It was observed with religious rites and a free public feast. But it was so popular that they just kept extending it until it was a full 7 days, ending on December the 24th. Labor, business, schooling, the government all pressed pause so that celebrants could participate in the music and dancing, the feasting and drinking, the social exchange of gifts, and homes were decorated and public buildings were decorated in greenery as a harbinger of the coming new growth. As familiar as these customs sound, there were plenty of others of the Saturnalia that are very unfamiliar to us, but surprisingly have only become so in the last 150 years. This is Saturn's temple. It's what remains on the right. That was his main temple in Rome. And during the Saturnalia, he had these woolen bonds around his feet, which they loosened on the festival, which was symbolically freed him to participate in the celebration, but it also metaphorically loosened the strictures of society that are normally in place. In Roman mythos, Saturn presided over a golden age, kind of an eternal spring of plenty and ease and peace. The social stratification, the oppression, the war, the want, the toil that would come to characterize later ages were not in effect during his rule. So celebrants of the Saturnalia tried to essentially recreate this egalitarian idol that the god represented by elevating those who were lowly and humbling those who were high and mighty. Assuming the voice of Saturn, one account quoted his view of the festival, saying, "Everywhere there is clapping and singing and playing games, and everyone, slave and free man, is held as good as his neighbor." To symbolize this equality, people from all stations donned the pileus, which is this little conical-shaped hat. It was felt, and if you were enslaved and someone freed you, would be given one of these little pileus as a mark of your freedom, your liberation. So everyone wore these as kind of a sign of that equality. Roman slaves were given leave to participate in the festivities, to speak their minds, to spend their time as they wished, and masters and mistresses would serve them at the table as they were seated in the place of honor. In the same spirit of this individual freedom, bans on gambling were lifted. Dicing was originally done with the foot bones of sheep and goats. So if you kind of picture those knuckle bones that, kind of have the ridge in the middle and the bumps, they could be played like dice or jacks. And eventually they were crafted of wood, stone, terracotta, and like this one, even bronze. To set an irreverent tone for the festival, a lord of misrule in each household was usually chosen as an agent of disorder. They dressed in bizarre and flamboyant clothes and broke the rules of etiquette and commanded other people to break the rules of etiquette so that everybody would be equally foolish. As the Roman satirist Lucian wrote, "You are made the sole king of all with a win at the knuckle bones, so that you not only escape silly orders, but can give them yourself." Telling one man to shout out something disgraceful about himself, another to dance naked, pick up the flute girl, and carry her 3 times around the room. Sounds a little like Festivus, but not quite. Sociologists generally regard such times of social inversion or a flip of the social order as a pressure valve that periodically vents off the frustrations of the oppressed and the enslaved. So it's not really intended as a revolutionary act. When things clamp back down to their norm, they clamp back hard. It's just to keep everybody happy for another year. Not coincidentally, Saturn was also credited with teaching humanity viticulture, and the drinking of large quantities of wine went a long way towards facilitating misrule. People watered down the wine and flavored it with honey and sometimes with spices and doled it out to everyone. Drink for the Romans was a feature and not a bug, as it would be for the church later on. The exaltation of the late 1st century Roman poet Statius makes this clear. Quote, "Who can sing of the spectacle, the unrestrained mirth, the banqueting, the unbought feast, the lavish streams of wine? Ah, now I faint, and drunken with thy liquor, drag myself at last to sleep." And we can see that the idea of the Saturnalia exists in the Christian mind for a long time. This is an 18th century reimagining of what the Saturnalia might have looked like. And if we look over here in the front, we see a gentleman pouring wine for this young woman. And then in the background, I'm not sure you can see it, but there's a couple who are passed out. The woman is in a state of undress. This gentleman is playing music while the blonde guy sings. And then if we continue on back, we see this character holding out a wreath and pointing to the statue of Saturn, which I'm having trouble. Oh, here he is. You can see his sickle here, and he's unbound. And then we've got lots of greenery, too. So they were hitting all the highlights. Sorry, time to change the page. So the free flow of wine also greased the skids of generosity. The Roman poet Martial claimed that the spirit of egalitarianism even extended to gift giving. Quote, "At this time of the year, when the equestrian," which I assume means basically a knight or a soldier, "and senators show off their party clothes, and even the emperor wears a freedman's cap, you accept the gift you have drawn, whether from a poor or a rich man. Let everyone give his guest an appropriate gift." Tokens on the high end included pigs and clay statuettes, gold hairpins, and on the low, it could be winter vegetables, dried fruits or dates, sweet cakes, and the like. All Romans exchanged these little wax taper candles that were representative of the strengthening sun with each other, but they also left them at Saturn's altar in their homes. Now, these reveries barely took a breath before the Romans slid into Calendar, which is essentially New Year's Day, observed from January the 1st to the 5th. It was primarily a civic holiday, so It lacked those religious rites of Saturnalia, but in all other ways, it was kind of indistinguishable in terms of how people celebrated it. The distinctive custom was an exchange of small gifts to bring good luck in the coming year. So it could be figs, honey, pastry, later coins, wreaths, garlands, and lamps bearing the greeting happiness in the new year. In 380, Constantine declared Christianity the official religion of the empire. The spiritual highlight of the Christian calendar at that time, and continues to be in the Orthodox Church, Christ's baptism or his spiritual birth. There's not that emphasis on his physical incarnation. There was disagreement even then and continues today as to when Christ might actually have been born. Most scholars thought and continue to think it was in the spring. So why do we have a nativity celebrated on a major period of pagan festivity? A lot of people suggest that it's an instance of syncretism, and that's when a pagan faith practice is absorbed into a new Christian context to facilitate conversion of the people. And the best evidence, in my opinion, for that being the case is the direct statement of Maximus, the bishop of Turin in the 5th century, basically gloating that they had successfully done that. But two contemporary giants of theology, Augustine of Hippo and Leo the Great, still found it necessary to remind everybody of the reason for the season. Only in this case, Christ wasn't competing with Santa Claus, he was competing with the sun. Regardless, it's clear that Christian writers made this date work for them. After all, there's a natural synergy between the idea of a renewing sun and the idea of a deity who is born flesh to conquer death and bring eternal life. By 567 AD, a church council established the days between Christmas and Epiphany, December the 25th and January the 5th, as a singular holiday known as the 12 Days of Christmas. That left Saturnalia completely out in the cold since it ended on the 24th, and it swallowed Calends whole. By the 9th century, the Nativity was celebrated on its own with a tailor-made liturgy. Now, it's not surprising that practices associated with the solstice, the lights, the greenery, the celebration, the gift-giving, would adhere to the Nativity. But what is surprising is that the rest of it stuck fast, too. Only 30 years into the existence of Christmas, the Archbishop of Constantinople had reason to rue the timing of his new festival. He and the Archbishop of Canterbury, some 13 centuries later, could have gotten together over a beer and complained about the ongoing overdrinking, overeating, social inversion, sexual license, all of it would remain unchanged through the early part of the 19th century. Now, when missionaries carried Christianity north, their shiny new festival would hit a couple of new pagan festivals at midwinter. And here we have the full, lurid Monty. Yule is set within an oak grove, which is supposedly sacred to the god Thor. If we read this image from left to right, we're going to see some dudes dressed in animal skins here, and they are leading sacrifices. So we have everything from a chicken somewhere, I've lost track of it, here's a cow, and then we've got a moose that's a little more exotic. And then in the background, I don't know if you can make it out, but we've got some captives netted to a tree, some human captives. And this blood sacrifice was known as blot. Upon the trees, we see some weaponry, which might be indicative of, we're not going to fight during this sacred period of time. And there's also a bunch of horse skulls, because horses were a prestige animal. So that would be a major important sacrifice animal. Then over here we've got the giant bonfire, and we've got a big cauldron, and then down here, I don't know if you can see it, but it's a collapsed horse that's just been felled by the dude with the knife. Where is he? This is hard to see from where I am. Oh, yeah. There he is. He's got the knife here. Right. There's another guy kneeling down over here, and here's
What's that guy doing?
He's kneeling.
No, the guy over here in the
This,
right. Looks
this
like
guy
he's
here
mixing something
with the
up.
wings.
These are rabbit ears.
I think they're wings. It's a winged helmet.
Wings on his head.
I don't know what he's up to. He's got a little pot, and supposedly they flung the blood on people,
Yeah,
so
cool.
I can speculate, but I don't really know.
I think he's gonna make me say stir.
Now, the problem with this kind of representation is that it's based on post-conversion sources. So these sources had agendas. They wanted to either, or maybe even both, discredit the old faith and also use elements of a romanticized lore to build a national identity. The earliest Scandinavian literature that has survived doesn't even mention Yule. But then we have post-conversion authorities like Snorri Sturluson, great name, right? He wrote the Prose Edda, so that's where we learn about Thor and Loki and all those escapades. And he wrote about Yule as a 3-night festival beginning at midwinter, whose sacrifices were devoted to ensuring a good crop in the approaching new year. But by the time the Danes introduced the term Yule to England, it just meant Christmas to them. So this is one of those cases where pagan faiths that weren't written down directly by those individuals and are characterized, sometimes hundreds of years later by other people who were never there or never part of that faith. It's hard to say anything definitive about what people believed or what they practiced. For their part, the English referred to the nativity as Midna Vinter, which certainly sounds pagan. If the grumbling and chiding of the church fathers was anything to go by, the nativity was beset with stubborn pagan midwinter customs everywhere the faith went. And one scholar cataloged some 40 admonitions from church fathers from the 4th through the 11th century in which they compared these midwinter doings with Callan Day customs. In England, the 12 days of Yuletide became the official state holiday in 877 under King Alfred, and by the 13th, the same was true in Scotland. So contrary to common wisdom, neither mistletoe, wassailing, nor the Yule log are going to make an appearance for several centuries. So how then did Christians in the Middle Ages celebrate Yuletide? Over the course of the Middle Ages, a collection of holy days were strung along after Christmas, and there were specific celebrations and rites and customs that were keyed to those themes, whether it's the slaughter of the holy innocents, that would be devoted to children in a grim, sort of appropriate way. But I'm not going to go over those because on PBS right now, they have Lucy Worsley's The 12 Days of Christmas, and it is beautifully done. I cannot improve, and we have other things to talk about. So check out Lucy Worsley on PBS. As she points out, Advent laid the groundwork for Christmastide. People were to abstain and fast for 4 to 5 weeks, depending on where Christmas fell. So not until after the 3 masses of Christmas Day was the fast broken, but it was really broken when they did. Regardless of the religious context, in any agricultural society, winter is the time to party. Number 1, you have time on your hands. There's nothing to be done in a frozen field. Number 2, you've slaughtered all your animals. You've brought in everything from the fields and stored it. So larders are fat and cellars are bubbling away. So after a month of fasting, overindulgence is almost inevitable. The 12 days of Christmas were filled with feasting, drinking, gambling, private parties at all social levels, organized entertainments, and late nights in the streets. From the Middle Ages through the Tudor dynasty, household accounts recorded staggering amounts of food and alcohol being served at the tables of the wealthy, and particularly the royalty. Here we have a little image of some people feasting in the Middle Ages. We've got a cooked peacock with its skin slyly snuck back on it so you can enjoy the spectacle of its beautiful plumage. Now, those who could were expected to hold an open house, entertaining anybody who came. In the mid-16th century, Thomas Tusser expressed the hospitality ideal, quote, At Christmas we banquet, the rich with the poor, who then but the miser but opens his door. But in practice, the wealthy mostly feted their own social equals and people who worked directly for them, whether they were managers or serfs in the field. At night, the streets were animated with troops of mummers, also known as geysers or maskers. The first written reference to this practice is in the 13th century, and the term meant at that time the wearing of masks or disguises. While elaborate fancy dress mumming took place at court, what took place in the street among commoners was completely different. Besides donning fake beards or masks, simple and effective disguises were blackening your face with charcoal or burnt cork, wearing animal skins. Some people made full head helmets of animals, and cross-dressing, both men as women and women as men. And that's very transgressive. In normal times, people who did that would be publicly shamed, just so you understand how inappropriate that would be most times of the year. Sometimes the mummers would wander the streets and perform a folk play, such as St. George and the Dragon, whose general outlines would remain the same, but this was performed for centuries, so different characters were added, some dropped out, and of course, if you wanted, you were hoping to be rewarded with money, so if you could make it more entertaining, it was a living tradition, so constantly changing. And here we have an image from the 19th century. We can see our mummers are entering over here through the open door, and we've got some people filing down through a back stairwell, maybe some servants to get in on the fun. And because this is the Victorian period, we have Father Christmas, and he would sometimes introduce the action of the play. Then back in the corner, we see a piper, and then this is the doctor. I can't see because I don't have my glasses on. And, okay, so here's the doctor in the truck, see him with the big puffy hair. Then we've got a dark-skinned Turk. Here's St. George. Everybody see our dragon? And then here's a maid. Sometimes the maid would be married to a wild man or maybe to St. George. It depends on the mix of characters. But the overall plot would be that St. George would take on the villain, whoever that was, whether it was Beelzebub or the infidel Moor, and kill them. And then the doctor's job would be to come and revive them. So there's been a lot of discussion about what this might mean in terms of resurrection and fertility rituals that might date back, but nobody really knows. Now, if this play was done in pantomime, as the mum in mumming kind of suggests, they could better conceal their true identities, because you would hope that the host, the proprietor, would try and guess your identity, and if he failed, then they owed you a drink or some money or a bite of food, and if they guessed accurately, then out the door with you. Now, Christ's call for humility even provided a platform for social inversion within the church itself. Minor and junior clergy took over for their superiors for a brief period of time, and during what was called the Feast of Fools. And they seemingly make a mockery out of sacred things like burning soles of old shoes in the censers, throwing dice at the altar, pretending to praise demons, and in one case throwing mud from the pews until the parishioners, quote, dissolved into disorderly laughter and illicit mirth. And I just love the idea of mirth that is illegal. I kind of want a t-shirt that says illicit mirth and nothing else. Priests and clerks even masqueraded as women, pimps, or minstrels while singing bawdy songs. And it seems to have been widely tolerated except for a few uptight bishops. Not until the 15th century was it replaced by boy bishops, a kinder, gentler custom from Germany that we'll talk about briefly. Now, regardless of the season, pagans were fond of bringing things in from outside, whether it was greenery or flowers. They just liked to bring it inside. So while the church debated the wisdom of co-opting this practice, it seems like Gregory the Great in the early 7th century specifically with England in mind, so it seems like this might have been pretty prominent practice there already, gave the go-ahead. Urban church accounts that survive from the Middle Ages show records for the purchase of greens for the 12 days. And according to a record from 1540, you would weave a frame of something flexible and then work the holly inside of it and then hang candles on it, and then it would be suspended by a cord. So it kind of looks like a Christmas tree, and when we talk more, you'll see some more connections there. And if you're interested in seeing what one of these looked like and you have Amazon Prime, there's the Tudor Farm series. They have a Christmas special in which they construct one of these things. By the time of Henry VIII, a journal observes that, quote, every man's house and not just the churches were done up in greens. Now, evergreens also became a central part of Christmas mystery plays. In honor of Adam and Eve Day on the 24th, a Paradise play reenacted the story of Eden. And this allowed for more humor than most plays did, because a lot like the Saturnine Golden Age, this Edenic setting encouraged a little bit of foolishness and possibly nudity. The focus of the set design, however, was a tree of paradise. It would be typically an evergreen that would be hung with apples that would be symbolic of the forbidden fruit. And an evergreen, because that's what's available, and sometimes they used a repurposed maypole from the spring, and this is just what a maypole looks like in Sweden. And paradise trees enjoyed particular popularity in the German lands, where they built these little wooden pyramids also to go on a tabletop, and you would wrap boughs around those to kind of create an artificial tree, and it had shelves for sweets and candles. So that's kind of another stream that feeds into the Christmas tree later. After a time, trade guilds would start putting up these paradise trees. But they're not really having anything to do with any religious proceeding. They're just for fun. For instance, in 1870, a Bremen guild set up a tree for its members' children, and after they were done dancing around it, they handed out the apples, nuts, and pretzels from the branches to the children. Now, the Middle Ages gifted the Tudors with a suite of established customs that were initially embraced by Henry VIII. And even though he broke with the Catholic Church, he was a pretty conservative person in terms of religion, and he kept a lot of this. But as the monarchy switched back and forth between Catholic and Protestant, depending on the preferences of the ruler, it was inevitable that some of these customs would get pruned. Somehow they convinced Henry that these biddable boy bishops that had replaced the outrageous Feast of Fools somehow decreased the dignity of the church. So gone then were the pretty young men in lavish bishops' robes, singing, preaching, blessing, and fundraising. More reasonable, perhaps, was his decision to ban mumming. Even before his reign, the city of London in 1409 prohibited anyone to, quote, walk the streets by night in any manner, mumming plays, interludes, or any other disguising with any feigned beards, painted visors, deformed or colored visages in any way. And evidently with good reason, because in 1414, Lollard heretics had planned to gain access to one of the palaces and stage a coup, quote, under color of the mumming. So ultimately, Henry banned it nationwide, but of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the end of anything. Now, from the late Middle Ages to the early Tudor period, a member of the king's courtiers were chosen as the Lord of Misrule. And it would be this person's job to plan elaborate entertainments for the court, for all the aristocracy and the royalty, whether it was plays, processions, feasts, whatever it might be. And he would also choose a court, a mock court, like the king's own retinue, to help him. And then when the festivities began, he was basically an MC. Other organizations that could afford the expense of something like this, like colleges and law schools and the great houses of the aristocracy, all appointed similar officials to do the same for them during the 12 days. And in some parts of Europe, it kind of filtered down to the common people. Oh, I'm sorry. This is where our first public guild-sponsored trees pop up in Estonia and Latvia along the Baltic Sea. So this is taking place in the Netherlands, and this is, we've got our king over here, and there's some scraps of paper showing us that he was probably chosen by a draw. And he's got a little paper hat, a little crown on his head that usually had symbols of the nativity, like Joseph and Mary and the baby. And then he could choose his own mock court, and then they could have a lot of fun pretending to be a bunch of posh aristocrats. And this is our king's fool, who is announcing the king drinks. So this was a popular thing throughout Europe for a time, particularly in France. Though a lord of misrule orchestrated some of the most elaborate and costly Christmas entertainments to date for Henry VIII's boy king heir, Edward VI, the practice lapsed soon after the boy's death, and similar figures and other organizations were done away with soon after that. Somewhat surprisingly, the Protestant Stuart dynasty that followed the Tudors saw the renewal of some old customs and the introduction of some new ones. As the nation began to feel more secure in the Protestant Reformation and less concerned about plots like the gunpowder plot fomented by Catholics, they found that they were warming to the idea of a green Christmas. George Wither in the 1610s observed that, quote, each room with ivy leaves is dressed and every post with holly. By 1639, almost half of the London parishes were done up for Christmas. Fragrant rosemary and bay were added to decorative schemes, and yew was mentioned in 1629. And finally, somewhere around the 1630s, poet and author Robert Herrick named our latecomer mistletoe, finally, as a viable Christmas green. As indicated in the 8th century poem Beowulf, wassail was originally a toast, meaning be of good health. But it took a lot of different forms. For a long time, the only thing that we know securely was about wassailing inside individual homes. So you would have a common cup, and I would say wassail, then take a drink, and you guys would say, drink hail. And then I would kiss the next person, pass the cup, and they would repeat this until everybody in the household had had a toast. I think I could use another one. But in terms of wassailing as groups of people who travel from home to home and trade a drink and a toast for some material benefit, there's no secure documentation. You know, there are descriptions, but you can't really tell. Are they traveling from house to house, or is it just in the same household? You can't really tell from what is relayed in the description. But it becomes clear around 1600 that people are traveling. A, quote, company of maids, according to John Taylor in 1631, approached a rural household calling, wassail, wassail, jolly wassail. They traded cakes and a bowl of drink for white bread, cheese, and minced pies. And there's no way to measure it, but it could be that this practice intensified in the early 16th and 17th century because people are starting to feel the impacts of industrialization, and you have a widening gap between the rich and the poor, and so you have more people in need of charity. And indeed, household accounts record payments to wassailers from the late 1600s through the early 1900s. Now, perhaps the youngest of these new Stuart customs was the Yule log, which is surprising, right? You might have thought that was one of the oldest. It was first documented in Germany in the Middle Ages and spread throughout Europe, but didn't get to Britain until the 17th century. Now, the logs were expected to burn several nights because people were going to be staying up late and partying. They needed light and warmth, and the hearths could accommodate up to 10 feet in width. So They might easily require a team of men or even a horse or two to transport some of these Yule logs, and exuberant rivalries developed between households over who could drag in the biggest log. And if we look at, oh, I'm sorry, here's some wassailers. Boom. So here's our log. And it almost looks like an illustration of the first written account, because you have, everybody cheering, the boys are dragging it in, this guy is doffing his hat to the lady of the household, and in this particular account that we have from the 1620s or 30s, it makes reference to the fact that the boys were rewarded by the mistress of the house with all the drink that they could hold. So, and oftentimes when it's brought in, it's a lot of fanfare, there's music, and then they light it with a chunk of the old log, which had been stowed away, and it was supposed to provide sort of a magical protection for the house for that year. Now, the Germans who had innovated the boy bishops and the Yule log weren't done with Christmas yet. A myth was being spun in the German lands about Martin Luther and how he had traveled into the forest at night and seen the stars twinkling through the fir trees and was inspired, brought one home, put it up in his home for his children, and attached candles to it and lit it, and used it as an instructive device for his kids about Christ's light. It's a great story, and even though I was raised Lutheran, I had never heard it, but my husband's grandmother had, and when I gleefully informed her that it was a myth, she was none too pleased. Not as excited and enthusiastic as I was about that fact. Over time, the tree became so closely affiliated with Luther that some people refer to Lutheranism itself as the Tannenbaum or fir tree religion. So in consequence, the Holy Night tree, known in Germany as the Weihnachtsbaum, began to catch on in principally Protestant areas of the German lands. The Catholics clung tight to their creche and their manger scenes. And here we can see, doesn't Luther look really thrilled? His idea worked out great. His kids are crawling on him. His wife is leaning on him. He looks super happy. Now, the real birthplace of the Weihnachtsbaum, or Christmas tree, however, was some 700 kilometers away from Luther's Wittenberg in the German Protestant region of Alsace. And this is the capital of Alsace, Strasbourg. It's on the border of Germany and France, and they kind of kicked it back and forth over the centuries. By the 1530s, the Christmas tree or the Weihnachtsbaum had taken up residence in the homes of Alsatians, and we know the custom was widespread because they had regulations. So ordinances that dictated that each family could only take one tree of a certain size from the forest. And the first time that it's documented is in 1605 when a traveler visits a family in Strasbourg over the midwinter period and observes a tree with paper roses of many colors, apples, flat wafers, gilded candies, which means coated in gold, and molded sugar, but no candles. The journal noted that the roses were a sign of the Virgin Mary and the wafers a sign of the communion host. So, but it seems like it was pretty localized. There's no evidence that it was outside of Alsace. But this local custom eventually spread throughout Europe, and that really is facilitated by the fact that Germany is not a united country at this time. There are lots and lots of principalities and small states, and they all have royalty, and they all have princesses that need to be married off to royalty. And so through marriages, the Weihnachtsbaum is seeded throughout Europe in the aristocracy. In each locale, the tree had to adapt to its new setting. In 1708, the German-born sister-in-law of the King of France provided the first description of a candlelit Weihnachtsbaum. In her native Protestant Saxony, quote, tables are fixed up like altars and outfitted for each child with all sorts of things, such as new clothes, silver, dolls, sugar candy, and so forth. Boxwood trees are set on the tables, and a candle is fastened to each branch. This penchant for hanging sweets and seasonal nuts and fruits on the tree led to the nickname the sugar tree, which would be shaken on Twelfth Night when the Magi arrive and provide their gifts to the Christ child. By 1761, Queen Charlotte, the German-born wife of English King George III, you remember he's the guy we fought a long, long time ago, erected the first firmly dated tree in Britain. In her home duchy of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, the Weihnachtsbaum was a single yew branch, so you can see any kind of greenery would do. And as it spread throughout Germany, without the benefit of Instagram or photographs or any means of reproducing it, the Christmas tree assumed a variety of different forms. In Austria and some parts of Germany, they actually hung the tree upside down in front of a window and decorated it hanging there upside down, which I used to work at a historic site, and we did that, and I can tell you it's a lot easier to hang a tree upside down from the ceiling than it is to make it defy gravity. In other places, they hung it right side up, sharpened the, what do you want to call that? Stump, not trunk, thank you. And then put an apple on there. So that's another way to do it. And it seems like Berliners just completely did not quite get the idea of hanging sweets on the tree because they gilded potatoes and hung those on their tree. And that was 1755, so that's pretty late. Now, the Puritans were staunchly opposed to Christmas in every way. It was obviously heavily influenced by paganism, as we have established, and even worse, villainous popery, which is what they called any kind of Catholic influence. But it was more than that. It was the gaming and the gluttony, which that definition includes overdrinking, and the sloth, which in turn motivated the lust, the greed, the pride, the wrath, all the deadly sins. So whether it was mumming, wassailing, or caroling, partiers had access to drink, and they also had a certain amount of anonymity under cover of darkness, or also if they were costumed. And that led to some transgressive behavior, kind of like people on the internet when they are not identified. They also are kind of transgressive. So as late as 1725, Reverend Henry Bourne of Newcastle groused about the practice, quote, "a changing of clothes between men and women who, when dressed in each other's habits, go from one neighbor's house to another and make merry with them in disguise." Can you see me raising my eyebrows? Worse to him were the carolers, generally done in the midst of rioting and chambering and wantonness. Okay, what does chambering mean? Well, let's think of the root word chamber, and then let's think about Homer Simpson and that episode where he felt like Marge had let him down, but he reassured her that he was still willing to do, quote, the bedroom stuff, and now you understand what chambering is. Influential preacher Cotton Mather also railed against the unholy way this holy day was observed in the colonies. In 1712, he said, quote, "the feast of Christ's nativity is spent in reveling, dicing, carding, masking, and in all licentious liberty, by mad mirth, by long eating, by hard drinking, by lewd gaming, by rude reveling." In the colonies where the Puritans were already ascendant, Christmas was struck from the almanacs. Schools, courts, shops, it was just another regular day. In England, the mad mirth was also dealt a losing hand in the English Civil War. We're not very well educated about this in America, but they also had a civil war. The Puritans allied with parliamentarians who wanted to restrain the king's power. And so they fought the king and the royalists, and the king literally lost his head. The victorious Puritans began to remake English society after their own dour image. Parliament banned the celebration of Christmas in 1644, and in 1647 passed an ordinance for the abolishing of festivals that would remain in force until the restoration of the monarchy some 13 years later. Charles I. They couldn't work it out. So lest anybody forget that Christmas didn't exist, they actually paid town criers to call "No Christmas, no Christmas." I mean, you couldn't come up with something like this. Christmas was driven literally underground, and to root out clandestine revelers, soldiers were actually authorized in 1656 to confiscate any groceries that looked like they might be able to be used in a traditional Christmas feast. Churches remained bare until 1660. Parliament met, shops were open, and schools were open. Now, Puritan social engineering didn't go without protest and even a riot or two. And before the Civil War began, pamphleteer John Taylor defended Christmas celebrations. And by the way, he was a prolific pamphleteer. He had an opinion about everything. So his was, quote, "A Complaint of Christmas" from 1531. And he openly acknowledged the social function of unrestrained midwinter celebrations. When his Father Christmas visits London and sees no sign of celebration, and I want to point out that Father Christmas here is a personification of Christmas, the old-time Christmas. He's not necessarily Santa Claus. The common people complain, quote, "All the liberty and harmless sports with the merry gambols, dances, and friskles," whatever that is, "by which the toiling plow swain and laborer were wont to be recreated and their spirits and hopes revived for a whole 12-month are now extinct. Thus are the merry lords of misrule suppressed by the mad lords of bad rule at Westminster," which is where Parliament meets. And in the woodcut, we see a Puritan greeting Father Christmas with "Keep out, you come not here." And Santa's like, or Father Christmas is like, "Let me explain. Oh, sir, I bring good cheer." And then this is your regular working man with his lunch pail off of the stick, and he says, "Old Christmas, welcome, do not tear." Isn't that sweet? In Josiah King's The Examination and Trial of Father Christmas, another pamphlet, old Father Christmas is put on trial for, from time to time, abusing the people of this commonwealth, drawing and inciting them to drunkenness, gluttony, and unlawful gaming, wantonness, uncleanness, lasciviousness, cursing, swearing, and idleness. In his own defense, old Father Christmas lists his biblical bona fides. He was announced by the angels, embraced by the church, and he claims that Christmas is abused by those who fail to listen to the advice from the pulpit, not because of him. Overworked and impoverished people testify that they would never have a break from work nor benefit from charity without old Father Christmas. The final witness from the town of Amity in the country of Unity clinches the defense with an argument sure to win over a populace that has long been divided by cultural extremism. Quote, "He is a very kind and loving man, inoffensive to all, a hater of strife, a lover of harmless mirth. Our whole town and country are much beholding to him when he comes, for he uses all means to bring us together and renew friendship. He is a great peacemaker." Ironically, centuries later, America, divided by its own civil war, would also turn to Christmas for a source of healing. Now, midwinter social inversion found a new context in America, one that nearly duplicated the relationship of a lord to his serfs. Anybody want to guess? Where in America would you find a lord and his serfs? The South. Southern planters pointed to Christmas revels as a prime example of their familial attitude towards their dependents. Planters granted the enslaved a lengthy break from work. They were allowed to travel quite a distance in case they wanted to go visit family members who had been sold off of the plantation. And even conviviality between the races was a possibility. Celebrations included feasting, drinking, gift-giving, and in one regional location, something very much like wassailing and mumming. And to an extent, this mirrored the social license that the white planter class granted to themselves. They started out drinking early in the morning, men and women, and passed the day in an alcoholic daze. Men also engaged in far-ranging, raucous visiting circuits known as Christmasing. The men of entire households, black and white, traveled as far as 20 miles from home and visited as many as 6 different homes. One Southerner in 1868 described what was by then a fading practice. Quote, "It was the custom and still is in more isolated communities for a crowd of young men to band together and with guns and every sort of instrument of music or of noise go Christmasing among their neighbors. If the proprietor heard them coming and got the first shot, it was their treat," meaning they had to give him a gift. But they generally stole up quite noiselessly and opened fire and called out, "Treat, treat," as they marched around the dwelling with their discordant music. This was called serenading and shooting up. The related game of Christmas gift was practiced in the big house, where the enslaved could sneak up on the white family members, and if they shouted Christmas gift first, they could demand a gift from that individual. While many enslaved men could join in these white-led Christmasing rounds, there were festivities designed specifically to placate the enslaved. Frederick Douglass was not amused. In his words, "These holidays serve as conductors or safety valves to carry off the rebellious spirit of enslaved humanity. These respites from labor could last anywhere from several days to a month, and in one part of Missouri in particular, it was all the way from Christmas Day until the 1st of February. Besides being freed from working for the planter, they could labor for their own benefit. So you had many skilled craftsmen among the enslaved, and so anything that they produced, they could sell and keep the profit from during this period of time, and any produce that was cultivated in their own garden plots could be sold for a profit that the enslaved could keep. Alcohol that was forbidden at all times, for obvious reasons, was provided in unlimited supply. Often the planter served the eggnog himself, and in some cases, alcohol was even forced on the enslaved. This is going to be some top-shelf gaslighting. Francis Frederick, an escaped slave, explained his former planter's rationale for making them drink. Quote, "Now you slaves, don't you see what bad use you have been making of your liberty? Don't you think you had better have a master to look after you, to make you work and keep you from such a brutal state?" Like I said, top-shelf gaslighting there. Former slaves interviewed by the WPA were living in poverty from having been cast into the world with their freedom and nothing else, and they often fondly remembered the luxury and plenitude of their planters' generosity. It was often the only time the enslaved got to eat meat, and the planters' wives and daughters sometimes prepared the meal themselves, sometimes they oversaw the preparation of the meal, and sometimes they served the meal. Masters usually showered the enslaved with gifts. One woman declared, quote, "If I could call back one of them Christmas days now when I was up to the big house and brung back my checkered apron full, Lord, I was so happy. Great big round peppermint balls, big bunches of raisins. We put aprons full on the bed and then went back to the house to get another apron full." In most cases, the enslaved could count on extras and not necessities disguised as gifts. But there were some Scrooges among the planters. One guy would just give them some extra barrels of corn and then brag about how much compliance and gratitude he garnered from doing so. Now, a comparison between the next two images, one pre-war and the next post-war, is very illuminating. Here we have an unusual view of the planter's home from the quarters of the enslaved. Can you guys, are you working? There we go, right back there. This symbol of the planter's status and authority is literally shoved into the background. A crowded and jubilant foreground places all the figures, black and white, at the same level. On the left, the planter's warmly smiling wife serves her servant, and over near the cabin, two top-hatted men. Here's one guy right here. Here's the other guy right there, I guess, yeah. While two white women stand back to view the music and the dancing of their enslaved. The apparent planter appears content. He looks kind of like a proud papa. Only the young woman holding his arm seems at all uncomfortable, but that could be because these two gentlemen behind her seem to be having a disagreement of some kind, and that might be a sly jab at how alcohol-fueled activities could maybe go sideways. Sorry, I lost my place, guys. Surprisingly, in their diaries, some of these planters expressed how far Christmas celebrations went towards assuaging their own guilt about enslavement. And of course, the message of this engraving as a whole is one of the comity between the races, how everybody's perfectly happy living under a state of enslavement. The white folk interact with their enslaved as if they were children, indulged and affectionately regarded. And surprisingly, for some whites, their own Christmas cheer was largely dependent on witnessing that of their enslaved. The second image is a different story, isn't it? Now the viewer, that's you and me, we're put kind of on a level with the planters. So we're sort of, well, you're not, but in a book, you would feel like you were looking down on the family in front. Here we're looking from the planter's house onto the cabins. And the planters are literally above and apart from their enslaved, very different from the previous image. This image is nostalgic. It glories in the deference, the debasement, and the dependency of the enslaved as they queue up to genuflect and provide Christmas greetings to their genteel white overlords. The fit of midwinter misrule, however, in the industrial North wasn't quite so snug because industrialists were no longer overseeing serfs. What they now had was a wage-earning proletariat. Industrialists expected their workers to work through the midwinter season, and the same had already been happening in Britain earlier. So think about Ebenezer Scrooge here. He's your industrialist. Rather than an instrument of social control, mumming and caroling and wassailing now became a weapon in the hands of the urban lower classes, which had been swelled by an influx of immigrants. And they could use these customs as a means of confrontation. So-called Calathumpian bands, and this is an image of this practice that was in a more of a rural setting where it had usually been, trooped through the streets on New Year's Eve, beating tin pans, blowing horns, shouting, and making cat calls. So it sounds a lot like Christmasing, right? But in the city. In 1822, a sheriff unconcernedly acknowledged that gangs of drunken men and boys knocked on doors, displaced signs, knocked down watchmen, set off firecrackers and shot pistols, and snowballed the, quote, frail fair ones of the city. I think he means young ladies. Once jailed, these revelers, quote, snapped their fingers, danced waltzes, whistled loud and shrill, and sang glees and catches, and they left without so much as a fine. In the sheriff's mind, this is what this season is for. It's about men of all classes engaging in a citywide carnival with very few limitations. In 1828, however, a violent Calathumpian parade left the Bowery, trashed and assaulted a black neighborhood, looted a shop, and got into it with private watchmen employed by wealthy homeowners. And indulgence would soon have its limits. The activities of children were just as unrestrained, and we don't have time to go into circuses and their behavior at theaters. We're just going to focus on barring out. This was a misrule that lived on in schoolhouses, as boys had been doing this since the late 16th century in England and started doing it in the early 1700s on our side of the pond. There's an autobiography of a former school teacher named Abel who related events in Pennsylvania from around 1820. So he gets to the schoolhouse and the door is locked, and there is a conspicuous absence of girls. So this isn't anybody's first time at the rodeo, so he figures he's going to go to the blacksmith shop and get some brimstone and drop that down the chimney and stop it up. But this isn't the boys' first time at the rodeo either. They are prepared with multiple buckets of water next to the stove for just such an occasion. So the game was basically, if they could keep the teacher out of the schoolroom for 3 days, they won. So starving them out would be another easy way to try and go. But they caught his attention through the window and showed him that they had a table full of baskets with cakes, pies, and cheese. They were set. So his next gambit was to stroll over to the blacksmith shop, act like he had lost interest, and play quoits, which was an early form of throwing horseshoes. And it worked. The boys got bored and went out into the field, and one came over and delivered their terms of surrender. You're going to love this. Abel would have to provide the students with 2 buckets of cider, and we're not talking non-alcoholic here, a bushel of apples, 50 ginger cakes, and 100 cigars. And there can't have been, more than 20 boys in the schoolhouse at the most. And they're all about, some of them are almost as big as the schoolmaster is. So he bides his time and then finally decides to make a break for it. But the boys, of course, have scouts who sound the alarm. Abel almost makes it, but not quite. And so then his only resort is to finally get an axe and pull the window frame off and then push the sash in because they had nailed the windows shut. And he jumped in, and they thought they were going to throw him right back out. But he made it to the desk and knocked on the desk, and that was the sign that they had lost. And he was much more generous than the schoolmasters in the 1600s in England, who would severely beat all the boys at this point. Instead, Abel instructed them to pull out all the nails, remove the barricades, and return their sashes. He then laughed and agreed to a pardon, but no cigars. But, it's crazy, right? I could spend a lot more time on that story. That's how long it is. But the misrule of midwinter was on its way out. Newspaper editors were encouraging female hostesses to start serving coffee instead of alcohol to their seasonal visitors. Respectability and domesticity rather than carnival and drunkenness would be the watchwords of midwinter now. But it wasn't just a matter of class difference. By moving Christmas off the streets and into the home, it was placed squarely within the preserve of women. And they had long been encouraged to conceive of themselves as shepherds of the domestic, the affectionate, the sentimental. By mid-century, wives would be dubbed the angel in the home. So the idea was that world out there was dirty and gritty and corrupt, and your men had to go out there and be rough and tumble. But when they came home, by God, you had a calming, nurturing, gentle environment for them to retreat to. So this is the place that this wild Christmas was getting relocated to. By 1852, the shift was underway, at least in the North. In William Sandy's book on the history of Christmastide, we see engravings of old and new Christmas, all summed up in greenery. This is OG Christmas, distinguished by bits of ivy and holly above the mantle and tacked around the windows and over pictures. Mistletoe claims center stage and subtly alludes to the unrestrained sexual license of an earlier era. A roaring fire, drink, meat, and dance feature prominently, and in the right-hand foreground, we have a child filling a container with alcohol, and that makes clear what is fueling the festivities. Now, new Christmas. Here we have an elevated Christmas tree that functions almost like an altar, and the figures have arranged themselves in this genteel parlor. The boisterous dancing has given way to elegant poses and intimate moments between the generations. We have women who appear to be handing treats from the tree down to the children that are near them. And if you'll notice, how many women are in this picture? How many men are in this picture? There's like 4 of them, right? Probably because they're all out wreaking havoc on the city. But you can see clearly this is a very feminized view of this holiday as it would come to be. And, women would also provide most of the labor for this new type of holiday. A respectful courtship is carried out over here without the help of any mistletoe. And all the warmth in the room is provided by sentimental affection. There's no Yule needed. And incidentally, the practice of kissing under the mistletoe was one of the newest traditions we've discussed, dating only to the 18th century. The unfortunately named kissing bush had existed prior, but nobody was kissing under it. And I made a trip to Germany, and this is some mistletoe in the market. And you can see where it grows way up high in the tree. So mistletoe is not something you just go out and grab. You know, if you're going to get it, you're going to expend some effort to do so. Now, one of the linchpins of this new domesticated Christmas holiday was the Christmas tree. But how did it get here from Germany? A combination, you had travelers, middle-class people from the United States traveling to Germany over the holidays and bringing information about this back. You had Germans immigrating to the United States for work, and they were recreating this practice. And then in the early decades of the 1800s, visitors to German areas of Pennsylvania were noting these trees, and that could be because those people may have been in correspondence with people from Germany and learning about it that way. Soon, German-American papers were picking up on this, and it was gradually becoming known. But for many people, the only way they could ever experience a Christmas tree would be to go to a fundraiser. They were very popular at anti-slavery fairs in particular. There was even a Boston SPCA event in which they put up a tree decorated with apples and sugar cubes for their rescued horses in the 20s or 30s, I can't remember. But it's going to be the homogenizing national media that will secure the place of the Christmas tree in Christmas celebrations. On the left, this is from the London Illustrated News in 1848, and it represents Queen Victoria and Prince Albert around a symbol of his home country's custom on a table with their children. And you can see there's gifts underneath the tree, not too many, but it's a pretty big tree and a lot of ornaments. And some of the magazines in the United States understood that Americans in the middle and upper classes were looking to burnish their social standing. And one of the ways of doing that would be to ape the practices of the British royalty. So editors knew that this might be of interest, but they wanted to make it a little more easily relatable. So you'll notice that Prince Albert has lost his sash and his little medal, so he's just a regular middle-class guy. And Queen Victoria has lost her jewelry. And the ornaments, the gifts are a little de-emphasized. And as you'll notice, there are fewer ornaments, but they are larger so that readers could study their details. And this particular conifer is one that is a specific type that grows in Germany. That's why it looks a little bit unfamiliar and kind of artificial. After this debut, Godey's was the women's magazine of the mid-1800s. They had subscribership all over the United States. They were like Martha Stewart, you know, they were the authority. They could sway the whole culture en masse. And so they introduced these trees and then discussed them in 1853 and gave a bizarre little history in 1855. Finally, this interest had built enough that Godey's felt people were ready for a how-to guide and packaged it inside of a fictionalized story in which you follow the characters from the point of putting the tree up to decorating it, how to light it, so you could just follow along. American Christmas trees differed in a few key ways from their European predecessors. Whereas the earliest indoor trees were short and usually on a table, that would be the case for a while, probably to keep the mice out of them. Americans, though, favored tall trees and eventually would have floor-to-ceiling trees. As early as the 1860s, Godey's lets us know why you want a tall tree, because everybody put the family presents inside the tree, not under it, unwrapped. So they would be nestled in the branches, some beneath the tree if they were too big, and this gift-bearing function would endure for a while. If you look here, we've got a brand new Brownie camera up here at the top. We've got a pair of gloves right here. And this is my dead people here. This is my great aunt. They've got something framed here, and there's a little doll here. So this thing really kind of hung on. And because of this gift-bearing function, along with the use of wax tapers, you needed the now defunct ritual, the Christmas tree reveal. So every story that discussed the Christmas tree practice recounted this point by point. Children were excluded from the parlor. The tree was put up. The candles were wired on. The gifts were nestled in the tree. The candles were lighted. Then the children were let in. And wow, what a spectacle, right? And we have a woman here today who still lights her Christmas tree with candles. And she says they can sing a couple of rounds of O Tannenbaum before it becomes important to snuff them out. So it's unlike us, we can leave our trees up and on for forever. This is a bright moment, a high point. And you can see the children's eyes, their faces are lit, they're enchanted and excited, and Mama and Papa are really enjoying their enjoyment. So once safely doused, then the gifts are handed down to the correct recipient, and it's over. As an insurance against fire, in 1832, a story recommended a bucket of water with a sponge on a stick so you could catch fires as they broke out across the tree. And then sometimes things did catch fire. In this story, one of the doll's petticoats caught fire, but luckily she didn't have to go to the hospital. She just needed a new petticoat. Now, beginning in the 1850s, magazine authors and people in their diaries expressed a real dissatisfaction with the regional sort of shallow holidays that they had. They yearned for something a little more rooted in the culture. And you have to remember that the country's only about 75 years old at this time. And unlike England, where the people who are living there have been living there, for millennia, the Americans just arrived and were very conscious of the fact that they were riding themselves over a landscape that wasn't theirs. So they were always looking for, what makes us unique, what makes us American, how are we different from the place that we came from, how does our new place define who we are. So it'll come as a surprise, I think, to most of us that even Independence Day, for states that were added after the Revolution, that seemed like a regional holiday to them. They didn't see that that had any bearing on them at all and did not celebrate it. So Thanksgiving was even more peculiar. It was just related to Massachusetts. So especially with the nation preparing to tear itself apart over the issue of slavery, people really wanted something that felt deeply rooted, meaningful, profound, that everybody could rally around. And, the real irony was that it was this holiday that the Puritan forefathers so staunchly sought to suppress that emerged in the 1840s and 1870s as that feel-good national holiday. And the Christmas tree proved to be a juggernaut in that respect. People from different regions found that they could adapt it. The first Christmas tree documented, oh, wait a minute, did I want that already? No, I don't know. We'll come back to it. The first Christmas tree documented west of the Mississippi was put up by a German immigrant, Gustav Kerner, who was also on President Lincoln's cabinet. They went searching for conifer trees on the banks of the Mississippi and were sorely disappointed because evergreens are not native to the Midwest. So they settled for the crown of a sassafras tree. And a lot of people liked these, especially if they lived in the city, because you could wrap them in cotton and then store them and then bring them down every year. And it is pretty. And let's see, he has a description of the tree, which I thought you might enjoy. Let's see, it was hung with ribbons and bits of colored paper, wax candles, little red apples and nuts, and all sorts of confectionery. Now, by the 1850s, Texans were embellishing their conifers, there it is, with Spanish moss, cotton bolls, the blooming, the cotton on the plant, pecans, red pepper swags, biscuits, sweets, and popcorn strings, which were an American innovation. In 1856, President Grant put the first Christmas tree in the White House for his young children. And by 1862, a visitor to San Francisco noted that even on the West Coast, quote, Christmas trees are the custom. And my favorite is James Clemens and his wife, who struck it rich in the Klondike and decorated their tree with $70,000 worth of gold nuggets. And even Europeans who were new to America did their best. Swedes to northern Illinois who settled amidst Germans understood that the candles don't throw that much light, and so anything shiny on the tree would magnify that, so they hung silver spoons on their tree. Now, while urban dwellers started to, let's go back to that. That's the first lighted Christmas tree, and he was a high-up guy in Edison's company, and they just wired those just for him. Here we go. So urban dwellers started to add manufactured ornaments starting in the 1870s. They might buy one or two a year. And here we've got reflective glass balls. Can you guys pick those out? We've got, they were the first commercially produced ornaments, again, because they would magnify the light. You guys see these here? Then we've got flags of every nationality were very popular, and then these little banners, they're kind of medieval-looking heraldic banners were popular. We've got a star here. There's a bird in here somewhere. I don't see it. We've got fairies, ballerinas. Thanks, Joe. Miniature drums over here. Miniature instruments were always very popular. We've got commercial candle clips, paper-wrapped candies. That's right here. It's hard to see. And that's about it. Now, rural celebrants cleaved to traditional decorations. Cookies, homemade candy, pine cones, dried seed pods, strings of popcorn and cranberries. Pennsylvania Dutch farmers loved their donuts. They already had strings of apple slices to preserve them for the winter, so those made natural garlands. And they also loved paper flowers, paper mottos, white sugar animals that were often painted with vegetable dyes, and the anise-flavored Springer Lake cookies that have the imprint of on the cookie roller, leaves an imprint of a design. And then those were left to dry before they were baked, and then they kept the design, and then you could paint it, wrap those babies up, and put them on the tree every year. A newspaper contrasted urban trees with those on Pennsylvania farms in 1898. Quote, "Tinsel, spangles, and colored glass have but little place on the country Christmas tree. Instead, there are huge honey cakes, ginger cakes, cut into shapes representing great fat hogs, sheep, rabbits, cats, horses, cows. Some of these animal cakes are several feet square and made attractive by a sprinkling of red, white, and blue sugars. Perched on the branches were stuffed squirrels, chipmunks, and other trophies of the country boy's skill with a shotgun. And taxidermy, interestingly enough, was a very popular hobby for boys in the 19th century. So this rings true. The tree is also laden with chunks of homemade taffy, large red apples, and winter pears, with a sprinkling of shellbarks, chestnuts, and other productions of the farm. Now, there had been a very small contingent of conservative people who were sort of against the Christmas tree. And already in the middle 1800s, you started to see special advertisements, stores open late, pressure to get that special gift. And a lot of people were reacting negatively to those elements. But by 1867, Godey's Ladies Magazine felt adequately secure in the Christmas tree's rootedness in American soil that it published a little piece entitled Christmas Sport. And sport here is in the sense of a jest or a prank, to mock the idea that any Christmas would be complete without a tree. So a reader acknowledges the labor and mess of a tree and suggests a no-muss, no-fuss alternative. A sawdust or bran tub will afford as much amusement and give far less trouble than a Christmas tree. The presents are wrapped in paper and put in a tub, which must be filled with bran or sawdust. A list of the names of children present is written, and they dip for their presents in succession as their names are called, all very orderly. The tub should be placed upon a sheet, which can be removed when the tub is emptied, and no untidiness will be visible in the room in consequence of the entertainment. The time consumed in preparation will be much less than for a Christmas tree, and the disappointment will be far less to the sanguine members of the infant community, who may have looked upon some particular toys until, desired to become their possessors, they may have felt injured when those articles have not fallen to their lot. So imagine you are in the middle of a Victorian Christmas tree reveal, and you are studying the tree while it is lit, and you see a particularly fetching toy soldier, only to find out that it's your brother's. That would make you not so sanguine. So, as we can see, Christmas trees grew out of this centuries-old set of midwinter's touchstones. The idea of renewing light, renewing growth, display and adornment, and gift-giving. And early on, the decorations were given religious symbolism, and then the Victorians really amped that up. There wasn't anything they couldn't give a symbolism to. And placed on a table, the trees explicitly recalled altars in the minds of those who were describing them. And few of us, live in the country, let alone on a farm. Most of us don't bring a tree in. We bring it up or down the stairs. But we still, crave that light on dreary winter days, fresh smells in our stuffy homes and offices, and warmth against the cold. And I must say that, many of us might now and then yearn for a Christmas tub, am I right? Especially when it comes time to take it down, because it's still an effort. So if you have been, feeling a little weighed down, just take comfort from the fact that people have been fretting about the commercialization and the pressure for a long time. And of course, as we stripped the 12 days away and crushed them down into a much smaller number, everything has a little bit more pressure put to it. And that's it. Does anybody have any questions? This was some kind of weird stuff that I laid on you. Anybody have any questions? Anybody freaked out? Are we all okay? Thank you. All right, well, if it occurs to you, raise your hand. But other than that, I really thank you guys for coming out on a cold night and giving me an audience, because I love this stuff. I used to work at a historic site out in Chesterfield. And when I was hired, they had a deal with area florists to decorate the period homes was basically a winter market, so historical crafts people would come and set up their wares for people to buy for Christmas. And everything was lit with oil lamps and lights, which I can tell you is barely lit, no matter how much of a fire hazard you decide to create. But unfortunately, the commercial florists didn't really have a sense of the historical, so we had plastic things all over the place, and I thought, my team can do something different next year. So we started doing some research, and I know that we overdid it. Most people would just be satisfied in the 1800s with a few sprigs scattered here and there, and that would be enough. But, we were stripping trees of their holly. We had these big pine trees.
You have to believe that even then, there were some overachievers.
Oh, yes, I'm sure there were.
So just claim that.
You're right, okay. Well, these were just the villagers were very into Christmas in our particular village. And we were really lucky because we had this nice contrast between these two homes. In the park is the oldest standing governor's mansion in the state of Missouri that was built in that location. But then they started saving these farm buildings from Chesterfield as it developed. And we got his son's home, and his son was a country doctor. But he and his family were from England by way of, Virginia. They had come through. And so they would not have really been familiar. He died before the end of the Civil War, the doctor did. So they would never have had a Christmas tree. So it was kind of fun because when I started doing the research, I couldn't even imagine a time before people put Christmas trees up at Christmas time. And then next door, we just happened to have a log cabin from some immigrants from Alsace, Ludwig and Salome Mertz. And they came in 1848, and they certainly would have known of the Christmas tree tradition by then. And so we were able to put a tree in their home and contrast it with the treeless, Anglo home next door. We hung them upside down, we hung them right side up, we put them in a pot, followed Godet's directions, we did the whole thing. So it was really fun. So that's how I wound up, weird like I am.
Falling in love with the holiday.
Falling in love with a holiday and the history of it. So, anybody got any questions? Yes?
Could you repeat what you said when you brought up the map of the Baltic states?
Oh, yes. So, these guilds, these trade guilds, so you could have like the Grocers Guild, that kind of thing. They would put up these big trees and hang, usually apples. Apples were kind of a consistent element, which I think kind of connects it to the paradise tree of the medieval mystery play. And then in some cases they would set fire to them and dance around them, which seems super pagan. And in other cases, like this one in Bremen, they would hand the food down that was on the branches to people. So again, this was outside of the context of any play. This was just for the fun of burning a tree, I guess. And it, all the places where this was documented to have been done by guilds was along the Baltic Sea, and that's very far north, very cold, very dark, so it really makes a lot of sense. It was Latvia and Estonia, and I think there was one in Russia, and then in different parts of Germany. There was one in Freiburg, in addition to the Bremen one that I talked about. And then in London, that reference is to one being blown down in a storm. But yeah, so we have like a pretty good chain, I think, of documentation, considering how long ago that was. Joe's telling me I'm out of time.
Yes, I'm afraid the evening is over.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. Happy holidays.
Thank you, Kelly, very much.